Around the year 1600, this, a dried seed, brown, wrinkled, smaller than a marble, was one of the most valuable objects on earth. Gram for gram, nutmeg could be worth more than gold. By the time it had travelled from a few tiny islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago to the markets of Amsterdam and London, its price could rise by several %. A single sack, smuggled home, could set a sailor up for the rest of his life. And whoever controlled the supply of it controlled a fortune almost beyond imagining. For nearly 200 years, one organisation did exactly that. It commanded fleets larger than most national navies. It minted its own money. It signed its own treaties, fought its own wars, and ruled over millions of people it had never asked for permission to rule. It was, by one widely cited estimate, worth the equivalent of nearly $8 trillion at its peak, more than today's largest technology companies combined. It was the first company in history to sell shares to the public, the first true multinational, the blueprint for the modern corporation, and for its darkest instincts. Its name was the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company. History remembers it by 3 letters, VOC. You would expect a company this powerful, this rich, this world-shaping to have died in some spectacular catastrophe. A great crash. A famous fiery end. It didn't. It rotted. Slowly, quietly, from the inside. Brought down by the exact same forces that still bring down giant companies today. This is the story of how the richest company that ever existed was built on spice and blood, and how it hollowed itself out until there was nothing left to collapse. To understand the company, you first have to understand the madness that created it. And it really was a kind of madness, a continent-wide obsession with spice. Today, nutmeg, cloves, mace, and pepper are things you barely think about, a few dollars in a supermarket aisle. But in 16th century Europe, they were luxury, medicine, and status all at once. Spices preserved and disguised the taste of food in a world without refrigeration. Physicians prescribed them as cures for very nearly everything. Nutmeg, in particular, was widely believed to ward off the plague, a claim with the twin virtues of being enormously profitable and completely false. And on a nobleman's table, rare spices were a way to show the world exactly how wealthy you were. The problem was geography. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew in only one place on Earth, a scatter of small islands in what is now eastern Indonesia, the Moluccas, and especially the tiny Banda Islands. From there, the spices passed through a long chain of middlemen, Asian traders, Arab merchants, the city of Venice, each one taking a cut, each one multiplying the price. For centuries, that chain was controlled by others. Then, at the end of the 1400s, the Portuguese did something audacious. They sailed around the southern tip of Africa and reached the source directly, cutting out the middlemen and seizing the spice trade for the crown of Portugal. For most of the 1500s, Portugal, and then the combined crown of Spain and Portugal, held the keys to the spice world. And the Dutch? The Dutch were the delivery boys. Dutch ships would pick up spices in Lisbon and distribute them across northern Europe. It was a decent business. It was somebody else's business. 2 things changed that. First, the Dutch went to war. The northern provinces of the Low Countries were in open revolt against Spanish rule, a grinding war for independence. And when the Spanish crown, now also ruling Portugal, closed the port of Lisbon to Dutch ships, it cut the Dutch off from the spice supply overnight. Suddenly the delivery boys had no cargo, and every reason to go get it themselves. Second, they got the map. A Dutchman named Jan Huygen van Linschoten had worked inside the Portuguese trading empire in Asia, and he came home with the closely guarded secret the Portuguese had protected for a century, the sailing routes to the Spice Islands. In 1596, he published them. The Portuguese monopoly of knowledge was broken. Now the Dutch knew where to go and how to get there. All they needed was the ships and the nerve. The first Dutch expedition to the east left in 1595. It was a disaster in almost every human sense. Disease, mutiny, death. Most of the crew never came home, but the survivors returned with enough pepper and spice to turn a profit. And that was all it took. Dutch merchants went into a frenzy. Rival trading companies sprang up in city after city. Historians call them the Voorcompagnieën, the pre-companies. Each one raised money for its own voyages, sent its own ships east, and came home to sell its own spices. And that was the problem, because they were all competing. When 5 Dutch companies all showed up in the same Asian port, the local sellers raised their prices. The Dutch were bidding against each other. And when all 5 came home at once, flooding Amsterdam with pepper, the price collapsed. They were driving up their costs and driving down their profits all at the same time. A business model with a certain purity to it, in that the harder everyone worked, the less money everyone made. Worse, they were divided against a common enemy, the Portuguese and Spanish, who could pick them off one weak fleet at a time. So the government stepped in. The States General, the governing body of the young Dutch Republic, pushed, pressured, and finally forced the squabbling companies to do something no one had ever done at this scale: to merge, to stop competing and combine into a single national champion. On the 20th of March 1602, they signed it into existence. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. And the charter that created it was extraordinary, because it wasn't really the charter of a company, it was the charter of a private empire. The government granted the VOC a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope for 21 years. No other Dutch citizen could legally trade in Asia. But the charter went much further than trade. It gave a business the powers of a state. The VOC could raise its own armies and command its own navy. It could wage war. It could sign treaties with foreign kings in the name of the Dutch Republic. It could build forts, establish colonies, and govern them. It could arrest people, try them, and execute them. It could even mint its own coins. In other words, the shareholders of a spice business had just been handed most of the working powers of a sovereign state, with the modest addition that this particular state was contractually obligated to pay them a dividend. Think about what that means. A joint stock company, a thing owned by shareholders existing to return a profit, was handed the right to kill in pursuit of that profit. The line between corporation and country didn't just blur. For the next 2 centuries, in half the world, it effectively disappeared. But the most revolutionary thing about the VOC wasn't its army, it was how it raised its money. Because to build fleets that would be gone for years, crossing oceans that killed half the men who sailed them, the company needed capital on a scale no single merchant, no matter how rich, could provide. So the VOC did something new. In 1602, it opened its books and invited the public, anyone with money to spare, to buy a share of the company itself. This is often called the first true IPO in history, the first time a company sold tradable shares to the general public to fund itself. And the people who bought in weren't just wealthy grandees. The share register from Amsterdam includes merchants, yes, but also craftsmen, servants, a maid, ordinary people buying a slice of the biggest venture of their age. One of the very first surviving shares was bought by a man for a modest sum. The piece of paper recording it still exists today. But here's the innovation that truly changed the world. In the earlier pre-companies, you invested in a single voyage, the ships came back, the spices were sold, the profits were divided, and the company was wound up. Your money was tied to one roll of the dice. The VOC was different. Your investment was locked into the company as a whole. Permanent capital that stayed in the business voyage after voyage, year after year. You couldn't simply demand your money back. So, what could you do if you wanted out? You could sell your share to someone else. And to do that, you needed a place to buy and sell. That place became the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the first modern stock market, built largely around trading a single stock, the VOC. And once you have a market, you get everything that comes with a market. for better and for worse. Prices that rose and fell on rumour, speculation, fortunes made on paper. And within just a few years, in 1609, a former VOC director named Isaac Lemaire, furious at the company, organised a secret syndicate to bet against VOC shares, deliberately driving the price down to profit from the fall. It was, as far as we know, the first organised short-selling scheme, the first bear raid, in financial history. The authorities were so alarmed they banned the practice. The ban did not work, which set a precedent that has held up remarkably well ever since. Almost the moment the modern stock market was born, so were market manipulation, speculation, and the regulators gamely trying to stop all of it. All of it, the entire architecture of modern finance, grew up around this one company. So, how do you actually run a private empire spread across half the planet in an age when a message to Asia and back could take 2 years? The VOC's answer was a machine decades ahead of its time. At home in the Republic, it was organised into 6 regional chambers, Amsterdam by far the largest, then Zeeland, and 4 smaller ones. Each chamber fitted out its own ships and managed its own money, but all of them answered to a single board at the top. That board had 17 members. They were known, plainly, as the Heeren 16, the Lord 17. 17 men meeting in secret, who set the strategy for an organisation that would eventually touch Japan, China, India, Persia, Southern Africa, and the whole Indonesian archipelago. They decided how many ships would sail, what they would carry, what wars would be fought, and how much of the profit would flow back to shareholders. The scale is hard to hold in your head. Across its lifetime, the VOC sent nearly 5,000 ships to Asia. It moved somewhere close to 1 million Europeans east, more than the rest of Europe combined. At its height, it employed tens of thousands of people, sailors, soldiers, clerks, craftsmen, and officials spread across dozens of trading posts. It was in effect a corporate nation-state, with Amsterdam as its capital of capital and a second capital, a military and administrative headquarters, planted on the other side of the world. That second capital had a name, Batavia, and the story of how it was built takes us into the darkest chapter of the company's history. To understand what the VOC was willing to do for profit, you have to meet one man, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Cohen rose through the company's ranks to become its Governor-General in the East, its supreme authority in Asia. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that Dutch commercial power could only be built by force. A phrase attributed to him captures his entire philosophy, that there could be no trade without war and no war without trade. To Cohen, the two were the same thing. Cohen fixed his attention on the Banda Islands. Remember, this cluster of tiny volcanic islands was, at the time, the only source in the world of nutmeg and mace. Whoever held Banda held a genuine global monopoly. The trouble, from the company's point of view, was that the Bandanese people insisted on trading freely, selling their nutmeg to English and other buyers, not just to the Dutch, and refusing to honour exclusive contracts they had never truly agreed to. For Cohen, that was intolerable. So in 1621, he arrived in Banda with a fleet and a plan. What followed was one of the most brutal acts of the early colonial age. Cohen's forces conquered the islands and destroyed the Bandanese society almost entirely. The population, estimated at roughly 15,000 people, was devastated. Killed in the fighting, executed, driven to flight and starvation, or enslaved and deported to work elsewhere for the company. Only a small fraction remained. By modern definitions, historians widely describe what happened at Banda as a genocide, and then, having emptied the islands of the people who had lived there for generations, the company repopulated them with enslaved labourers and Dutch overseers to run the nutmeg groves as plantations, a supply chain now owned, root to branch, by the VOC. This is the part of the story that the richest company in history headline leaves out. The wealth was real, the dividends were real, and they were built, in places like Banda, on conquest, forced labour and mass death. The VOC was not only the ancestor of the modern corporation, it was also a machine for turning violence into shareholder value, and it is impossible to tell its story honestly without saying so. 2 years before Banda, in 1619, Cohen had also seized a port on the island of Java, razed the town that stood there, and built on its ruins the fortified city of Batavia, today's Jakarta. Batavia became the beating heart of the VOC's Asian empire, the hub through which the spices, textiles, porcelain, tea, and silver of an entire hemisphere would flow for the next century and a half. The machine was built. Now came the money. For most of the 1600s, the VOC was simply the most successful business on earth. It didn't just haul spices anymore, it wove itself into the trade of all of Asia. It carried Indian textiles, Chinese porcelain and tea, Japanese silver and copper, Persian silk. It ran an internal Asian trade, buying in one port, selling in another, that earned money without a single ship ever returning to Europe. It established a resupply colony at the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa to service its fleets, a settlement that would one day grow into Cape Town. For decades it held the only European foothold permitted in Japan, trading from a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbour when almost every other foreigner was banned. And the profits flowed home. The VOC paid dividends to its shareholders on a scale that made it legendary. On average, historians estimate somewhere around 18% a year, sustained for much of its existence. Sometimes it paid in cash. Sometimes, when ready money was awkward, it paid shareholders in actual spices, which is certainly one way to receive an investment return, if a slightly inconvenient one to carry to the bank. An investment in the company could support a family for generations. Which brings us back to that staggering number from the beginning. By one widely cited estimate, at the height of a speculative boom in its shares, the VOC's market value, adjusted into modern terms, reached something on the order of $7 to $8 trillion. Economists argue about the exact figure, and you should treat any single number with caution. Comparing across 400 years is as much art as science. But even the skeptics agree on the shape of it. No company before it had ever been worth so much, and few since have come close. For a time, 17 men in a room in Amsterdam sat atop the most valuable enterprise the world had ever produced. And that is usually where the story stops. The triumph. The richest company in history. But a company is not a monument. It is a living thing, and living things can rot while still standing. Even at the height of the golden age deep inside the machine, the decay had already begun. The VOC did not fall because of one dramatic mistake. It fell because of 100 small ones, compounding quietly over decades. And every one of them will sound familiar to anyone who has watched a great modern company decline. First, corruption. The VOC paid its overseas employees modest official salaries, but placed them in charge of goods worth fortunes, thousands of miles from any real oversight. Predictably, they helped themselves. Company men ran their own private trade on the side, skimmed from the company's cargoes, cooked the books, and pocketed the difference. It became so pervasive that, centuries later, the Dutch would joke bitterly that the letters VOC really stood for Vergen onder Corruptie, perished under corruption. It is the kind of nickname that only ever sticks when everyone quietly knows it's accurate. The company was, in short, being looted from the inside by the very people employed to run it. Second, war got expensive. The company's whole model depended on force, forts, garrisons, fleets, and constant fighting to defend its monopolies. In the 1600s, when margins were fat, it could afford that overhead. But maintaining a private military empire is ruinously costly, and as the profits on spices thinned, the cost of the guns did not. The VOC was carrying the expenses of an empire on the income of a business. Third, the world moved on. The great age of the spice monopoly faded. Nutmeg and cloves became less scarce and less profitable as rivals broke the monopoly and tastes shifted. The company pivoted to bulkier, lower margin goods, textiles, tea, coffee, which meant more work for less reward. And it now faced a rising, aggressive competitor, the English East India Company, which was steadily winning the contest for India and the future. And fourth, the fatal one, the dividends. For all these years, the VOC had prided itself on paying its shareholders handsomely, and it had no intention of stopping now. So it kept paying its famous dividends, right through the years when it was, in the strictest accounting sense, no longer actually making any money. When the profits failed to materialise, management arrived at a solution of real elegance. They would simply borrow the money and hand that to the shareholders instead. It is the financial equivalent of taking out a loan so the neighbours keep believing you're rich. A strategy that works beautifully, right up until the precise moment it doesn't. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the heart of the whole collapse. The VOC took on debt to keep paying dividends it could no longer afford, handing money to shareholders that it did not have, to preserve the appearance of the golden age long after the gold was gone. Every guilder paid out that way was a guilder of borrowed time. The company was quietly converting its own future into a present-day illusion of health. By the second half of the 1700s, the machine was still running, the ship still sailed, the flag still flew over Batavia, but underneath the VOC was hollow, corrupt, over-leveraged, outcompeted, and propping itself up with borrowed money. It needed only a shock to bring the whole thing down. The shock came. In 1780, the Dutch Republic stumbled into war with Britain, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. For the VOC, it was catastrophic. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, seized Dutch ships, and choked off the company's trade routes. The lifelines between Amsterdam and Asia were cut. Cargoes stopped arriving. Revenue that was already thin now dried up almost completely, while the costs and the debts stayed exactly where they were. The hollow company could not absorb the blow. Its debts spiralled beyond any hope of repayment. The dividends, the pride of the golden age, finally stopped. And the VOC was forced to do the one thing it had spent 2 centuries avoiding. It went to the government, cap in hand, and asked to be rescued. By the 1790s, the Dutch political world itself was being turned upside down by the shockwaves of the French Revolution. A new revolutionary government, the Batavian Republic, took power. And it looked at the VOC, once the pride and engine of Dutch wealth, and saw only a bankrupt, corrupt relic drowning in debt. In 1796, the government effectively took the company over, stripping the Lord 17 of their control. And on the last day of the year 1799, the charter of the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie was allowed to simply expire. It was not renewed. The most powerful commercial enterprise in human history was wound up with roughly the ceremony you'd give a magazine subscription you'd stopped reading. The state absorbed what was left, the ports, the forts, the colonies, and an enormous mountain of debt estimated in the hundreds of millions of guilders. There was no great battle for its end, no final dramatic crash. The richest company that had ever existed died the way over-leveraged giants usually die, not with an explosion, but with a signature on a document quietly declining to keep it alive. After 197 years, the VOC was gone. So, why does a dead Dutch company from 400 years ago still matter? Because almost everything about the modern corporate world was rehearsed here first. The VOC was the first company to sell shares to the public, and the reason the first stock market exists. It gave us, for better and for worse, the joint stock company, the multinational. The very idea that thousands of strangers could pool their money into a permanent, immortal institution that outlives them all. When you buy a share of any company today, you are using a tool the VOC helped invent. But its legacy is double-edged, and honesty demands we hold both halves. The VOC also pioneered the darkest logic of the corporation, that in the pursuit of profit and market share, a company will do what it is permitted to do. And if it is permitted to conquer, to enslave, to destroy a people like the Bandanese for control of a supply chain, some companies will. The VOC is the ancestor of the boardroom and of the idea that shareholder value can be worth more than human lives. Both of those inheritances are still with us. And then there is the simplest lesson of all, the one hiding in how it actually died. The most valuable company in the history of the world was not killed by a rival or a war or a single catastrophe. It was killed by itself. By corruption, it tolerated because the money was good. By costs, it refused to cut. By a comfortable story about its own greatness that it kept telling long after the facts had changed. And, above all, by paying out money, it didn't have to keep up appearances, borrowing from the future to look healthy in the present until the future finally arrived and the bill came due. Every one of those things has sunk giant companies since. Every one of them is sinking companies right now. The VOC ruled a quarter of the world's trade for the better part of 2 centuries. It made kings of merchants and merchants of maids. It built the machinery of modern finance, and it committed atrocities to fill its holes. And in the end it proved a rule that no amount of wealth has ever repealed. That no company, however rich, however powerful, however sure of its own permanence, is ever too big to rot. The nutmeg is worth a few dollars now. The company is dust. But the lessons it left behind have never once gone out of date.